We start our paper 3. Our paper 3 is pre-romantics and romantics, and here we begin with the in background of poetry, background of paper pre-romantics and romantics. So in this background we will discuss poetry in 18th century and transitional poets. So we will understand this background of this paper with these points: the 18th century, mainly an age of great prose, major neoclassical poets, Alexander Pope, Oliver Goldsmith. Transitional poets, neoclassical versus romantic strength. The 18th century is considered as an age of great prose. The 18th century has justly been regarded as an age of great prose and of second-rate poetry. A multitude of practical interests arising from the new social and political conditions in the country demanded expression not simply in books but more particularly in pamphlets, magazines, and newspapers. Poetry was inadequate for such a task. This was, therefore, an opportunity for English prose to manifest its potentialities. The rapidity with which English prose developed in this century is really surprising, and the degree of excellence which it achieved is even more surprising. There is nothing in the poetry of this century to equal the graceful elegance of Addison's prose, or the terse vigor of Swift's prose, or the artistic finish of Fielding's prose, or the sonorous eloquence of Gibbon's history and of Burke's oratory. Indeed, poetry itself became prosaic in this century. Poetry was no longer used for the creative works of imagination, but chiefly for essays, satire, and criticism. That is exactly for the same practical ends for which prose was used. The poetry of the first half of the century, as represented in the work of Alexander Pope, is polished and witty enough, but it is artificial and it lacks fire, fine feeling, enthusiasm, and the ardor of Elizabethan age. This poetry interests us as a study of life. It does not delight us or inspire us by its appeal to the imagination. However, in the latter years of the century, a change began to manifest itself in the character of poetry, and this change gracefully became more and more emphatic, leading finally to the splendid outburst of romantic poetry at the dawn of the new century. And there are some poets that are considered as major neoclassical poets, such as Alexander Pope, Oliver Goldsmith, Swift, Addison, and Johnson. Some of the best prose writers of the 18th century wrote poetry also. Swift, famous as a satirist in prose, wrote a number of satirical poems too. Then there was Joseph Addison, who famous chiefly for his essays and for his portrayals of Sir Roger de Coverley. In them wrote a number of poems which won great popularity in his own time, though they were forgotten afterwards. He produced a tragedy in verse under the heading of Cato, which was an excellent example of rhetorical poetry. He also wrote a large number of rhymes. Dr. Samuel Johnson, another great writer of prose, also tried his hand at poetry. His best known work in this sphere being The Vanity of Human Wishes. Now we move to neoclassical versus romantic strain, or we can say here that we will see what is transitional poetry. Pope, Swift, Addison, and Johnson, they all represent neoclassical poetry which flourished in the 18th century, with the heroic couplet enjoying the prime status in versification and with the moral, didactic, intellectual, and satiric elements reigning supreme. Much of the diction in the poetry of these men was pompous, inflated, and artificial. But the 18th century also produced a number of poets who represented the romantic strain in poetry, though only in germ. The chief among this dissident group were James Thompson, William Collins, Thomas Gray, Oliver Goldsmith, William Cowper, Robert Burns, and William Blake. So we will see something about James Thompson. James Thompson is known for his following poetic works: The Seasons, Liberty, Castle of Indolence. The Seasons was his best work, matched by The Castle of Indolence. Thompson was a man of a vivid imagination, and his early life amid the romantic scenery of the countryside where he was born proved a happy source of inspiration for him to write these poems expressing vague but unmistakably romantic feelings about nature. Now we come to William Collins. William Collins is another poet of the transition from neoclassical poetry to romantic poetry. Collins' output of verse was certainly slender, but its quality was fairly high, especially in the shorter odes. Collins' poems show a delicate poetic vision through in his case to we perceive the partial continuance of an artificial and pedantic diction. In poems like How Sleep the Brave, he reveals a gift of rhythmic music which is quite refreshing. His Ode to Evening displays the writer's capacity in portray natural landscape in a simple and direct fashion. Unfortunately, this poet was afflicted by a temperamental melancholy and by a susceptibility to madness which led to this premature death. Then Thomas Gray was a scholarly man like Collins, and like Collins again, he was a careful literary artist. Though Collins was certainly superior to him in creative power, Gray is famous chiefly by virtue of his elegy written in a country churchyard. According to a critic, Gray was the most accomplished craftsman of the transitional period, and there was a steady progress in his work from the sometimes colorless and often conventional odes of his youth to the striking felicities of his famous elegy and the brilliant manipulation of the later pindaric poems. His last efforts in the writing of poetry show him as a pioneer of Romanticism. His special contribution to poetry lies in the fastidious accuracy of his natural descriptions. Collins was an observant, and Thompson was as warm in his regard for nature as Gray. Then William Cowper. William Cowper was like William Collins, a victim of a mental condition which ultimately led to insanity. He is now chiefly remembered as the author of a delightful ballad, John Gilpin, and for a more ambitious work, The Task. Indeed, on the basis of The Task, Cowper ranks among the finest English poets. There are signs of the coming romantic movement in poetry in him, no doubt, but he also shares some of the qualities of the neoclassical school, such as clarity, a painstaking care for expressions, and an easy tranquility of atmosphere. There is in his poems neither the passion nor the strangeness of the romantic school, and he is in fact more of a neoclassical than a romantic poet. Then we move on to Oliver Goldsmith. He is more famous for his prose works than for his poetry, but even in the sphere of poetry, his composition, The Deserted Village, is a highly estimable work. In fact, Goldsmith is generally regarded as an important poet of the Romantic dawn. As a literary historian points out, Goldsmith was too much influenced by his friend Dr. Johnson and the neoclassical in his manner of writing poetry, but in his matter, in his sympathy for nature, and in his expression for human beings, he undoubtedly belongs to the Romantic school. The Deserted Village is one of the best known poems in the English language. It is written in the favorite meter of the neoclassical school, but Goldsmith's feelings for nature and his portrayals of the village parson and the village schoolmaster link it with the Romantic school. Then Robert Burns was a Scotsman. He too is one of the precursors of the Romantic movement in 18th century. In his pictures of man and woman, he is vividly concrete, and by looking at these pictures in his work, we feel as if we were living in the open air, with the smell of the earth in our nostrils and the sound of careless laughter and ancient agonies in our ears. Burns was a true Democrat, but his radicalism in this respect was poetic, not political like that of Shelley or that of the youthful Wordsworth. Burns loved freedom as the breath of life, and this passion for freedom and for the free expression of individuality marked him as a true romantic. Among his best remembered poems are Tam O'Shanter, The Jolly Beggars, The Quarter Saturday Night. In this sequence, we take William Blake. William Blake has a mystical bent of mind. He is best known for his songs of innocence and his songs of experience. But his mystical nature found the fullest expression in such poems as The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, The Gates of Paradise, and The Vision of the Daughters of Albion. So we can here discuss the analysis of one of critics of the period of transition from neoclassical poetry to romantic poetry. Towards 1770, one can speak of pre-romanticism. Before this date, it is better to look upon a Collins or a Gray as the most complete representative. At this provisional stage of the poetry of sentiment, their work shows us the fusion of the successive themes which go to make up this poetry. To the love of nature and melancholy is added that of the past, the attraction of ruins, the curious desire for the erudite knowledge of bygone times, the sense of archaism, the exercise of imagination in a word is intimately. So now we see that what are the basic essentials of this romantic poetry. The basic essentials of romantic poetry are emotion and imagination. The neoclassical poetry of Pope and others is intellectual, moral, and didactic, and it is lacking in emotion and in the exercise of the imaginative faculty. Neoclassical poetry is realistic, no doubt, but even its realism is incomplete and unsatisfactory because of the absence of emotion and imagination, which are a necessary part of human life. Much of neoclassical poetry is satirical, and it is satirical because the neoclassical poets aims at reforming society and ridding it of its vices and follies. In the work of the major romantic poets of 18th century, emotion and imagination will be found in full flower. Indeed, in the work of a poet like Shelley or Keats, emotion becomes excessive and imagination crosses all bounds. Another notable characteristic of romantic poetry is its concern with nature and with man. A romantic poet feels greatly attracted by natural scenes and natural phenomena, and at the same time, he feels interested in the welfare of mankind. In other words, a love of nature and a love of humanity are among the principal marks of a romantic poet.